In an earlier episode, we talked about unreliable narrators and the fun you can have as a writer creating them. But what is the broader role of the narrator in fiction? And how can you create and write better and more captivating narrators? Welcome to the Writer's Gym. The Writer's Gym podcast. Build creative confidence and grow your writing life. With Rachel Knightley and Emily Inkpen. Rachel Knightley.
Chris Gregory.
Emily Inkpen.
Chris Gregory.
Welcome to this episode of the Writer's Gym podcast, where we are going to be talking about narrators.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Here we are.
So, the world of narrators in fiction. Let's start by
narrating the situation. Chris, Rachel and Emily were sitting in Rachel's living room.
And that is a perfect example, really, isn't it? Because when a narrator is there for a reason, it is a joyous, beautiful, fascinating thing that adds to what you're doing. However,
Rachel
sometimes... And then tell us how she said it, why she said it, and the 27 things about her past you need to know to understand all the depth of why she said it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And this is the thing, isn't it? That the other thing a narrator can do if it doesn't really serve the story is be there because you think you have to have one. And this is going to be quite an enjoyable one for me because it's always interesting to know what we do because we're curious to do it. And what we do because we've somehow got a received thought in our head from whoever or wherever going, this is what a writer's supposed to do. Narration is good. And narration can be wonderful. But like anything, it needs to serve the story. So this is going to be an interesting one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we're going to explore examples of narrators being well done, examples of narrators being poorly done, overbearing narrators, inconsistent narrators, and all sorts of other things about narrators. Now, Emily, you famously, probably not famously, but famously
yeah.
in this room, don't use narrators in your writing. Is that a choice that you consciously made, or was that just something that you fell into?
So it was a conscious decision. When I first started writing The Dex Legacy, I played around with a lot of options because you do. Like, you're going into another medium and you think, okay, well, I could do this, I could do that, I could do the other thing. And in audio, it is really tempting to use a narrator to describe what's going on because people can't hear it. So it's really, really tempting to use a narrator to describe what's going on because people can't see it. It's difficult to sometimes sort of take a step back, but I did. And I was like, you know what? The actual sort of fact of things is that the Dex Legacy just doesn't work with a narrator. It just doesn't. It needs to be straight up dialogue. It can't have that separation. And that's the thing with narrators, is that they separate the listener or reader or viewer from the characters, because there's that reminder. The narrator is a reminder that you're not in it with the characters. You are observing it.
Yes.
And the narrator is telling the story. And that's great in a lot of mediums, but it just doesn't work for the Dex Legacy, which is actually really annoying because they make things a bit easier sometimes.
When you say annoying, is it something that you've enjoyed using in other areas? Is it something you want to use more of?
No, it's literally just annoying from a mechanical point of view, in that a narrator can tell people what's going on, a narrator can provide context about the world. You know, when someone says something, you could have a narrator chip in and say, this was related to the so-and-so, which happened with this. But of course, Ren doesn't understand that because Ren is blah, 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 and everything, and then back into the story. But that would just not work in Dex Legacy.
But there are examples where it works beautifully and brilliantly. We will talk about some of those later. But Rachel, what about you? I mean, your stories, they have narrators or characters that narrate?
Because I am predominantly short stories, most things have happened at some point. Yeah. My tendency is to not want or need one because, in a way, as Emily was saying, that there is that sensation of, am I thinking I need to tell the reader something? And if so, what does that tell me I haven't shown them? And go back and find a way of doing it. However, one of my favourite stories, the first couple of lines, you don't know a narrator is there. The vampire considers his reflection. And in that, you've already got, what? Because obviously they don't have them. And what you get quite quickly is the vampire is in fact a member of a dance troupe putting on his makeup, and then the skeleton bride comes in and tells him off for something. And it's spooky, but it's also very mortal. But within a few lines, while that vampire is alone in the room, you get a couple of very specific examples of the action of what that character is physically doing. And then it's what an observer might think is this, that, and the other. But then it's not me. I don't count. And then it carries on observing. So you know that that narrator is not just floating there. You know that there is an I telling you the story. And gradually I reveal who that is and why they're not visible. And I enjoyed that enormously, that narrator device. But the reason I enjoyed it as narrator was because it wasn't a narrator separately. It was a character. And that's my style and my enjoyment.
I think that's the thing. Like, a lot of the time, the narrator does need to be a character in and of themselves. They can't be just a pure removed voice, because it needs to be involved. They need to have a kind of involvement, right?
There was a really, really funny one the other day on Radio 4 in which David Mitchell was talking about why, and I'm using this example because the film is incredibly successful and is not going to be harmed by me sharing David Mitchell taking the piss out of it. But what he said about Titanic was that there's absolutely no suspense whatsoever, because you know what's going to happen, and only two of the characters might survive, and you know that only one of them does, and oh wait, it's the one narrating from the beginning. And it's by its nature, And if you can sort of hide who the narrator is or how they survived or who they are these days, there's a bunch of them that are absolutely wonderful. I would not be without Dr. Watson in Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes would not have the mystery of somebody who looks up to them, loves them dearly, is driven nuts by them. That would not be such a successful recipe without Dr. Watson going, how on earth is he going to do it again? You know, and Dr. Watson, again, gets taken the piss out of, but actually it's a wonderful device. And it creates such a sense of what friendship and love and admiration really are. And so I am not dissing it, but at the same time, I think it's about not over-relying on it. If it's got something that adds to your story, it's a wonderful thing, but it's not a necessity.
So probably two categories. There may be more, but the narrator who is part of the story, an active participant in the story, but telling the story to you as a character. And, Dr. Watson, the advantage of that is that in interacting with Holmes, he can ask questions. It's an active narrator character relationship.
It is an active narrator. I think just to be fair to the other kind, we could totally argue that Aesop is an active narrator. It's the god saying, "Oh, best beloved," talking to you, telling you the story. So I think active is a useful term as a writer to use. I mean, if we were sitting here being critics rather than how do we writers gym this, how do we bring this into our own lives to use these different things, it might be arguable. But I think active. I think present might be a word I'd use.
And a term, you've hinted at it there, for the other sort, the passive, I am not in the story, I am telling the story, is voice of God. I've heard it described as...
It's very fairy tale. So I would call that fairy tale-esque as opposed to character involvement. Because when you've got a character narrator, it's like, I am telling you this story for a reason because it's my story to tell, almost. In a fairy tale, it's like, once upon a time there was a this.
Yes.
And the story is going to unfold. But the narrator is just there to set up the story and to provide a bit of context where needed. But it's not there to be involved or to be invested. You've got example like the book in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The book is very definitely a character of itself. It's not invested in the storyline, but it is kind of a narrator because it is a narrator because it explains what's going to happen. It engages with the story. It provides facts and
it knows the whole time stream.
Exactly.
It knows all of time and space.
Exactly. So it informs you that nobody's going to get hurt apart from a slight bruising to the elbow. To the elbow. And, but for the sake of suspense, whose elbow it is will be left unsaid. It was Arthur. So... it's an excellent commentary, but it is a commentary on the relationship between listener and action and all of the rest of it. It's a very complicated and beautifully executed relationship narrator role.
Shall we bring in Terry Pratchett here as well? Because it would just be rude not to. having that voice of the universe, as Douglas Adams does, as I'll take Discworld as the example, where the reason the omniscience works is that you are never unsure that there is a strong, steady voice holding you up. It knows where it's sitting. Now, I could say what I think that is, you could say what you think that is, and it's fine, but we could be right or wrong according to the author, but we're right according to ourselves. It knows where it is.
Yeah. Another example I'm going to throw in, actually, of that type of narrator is the audio drama Victoriosity.
Yes.
Chris and Jen Sugden. Wonderful narrator character who is a lot of the humour in the story because of the way that they describe
what's
events.
going on and who it is and why.
And that sort of archly knowing and slightly judgmental about characters sometimes.
And sarcastic, deeply sarcastic.
Yeah. And there is now a book of Victoriosity called High Voltage. Yeah. Voltage spelled V-A-U-L-T.
Yeah.
But one wonderful example of the use of a narrator.
Yeah.
Can we think a little bit about the types of story, novel, drama, etc., in which writers might choose to use a narrator? What sort of plot choices might guide them towards that?
Can I answer that and not be held to account for my tone of voice as I use my first example?
We're never held to account by anything we say.
Jolly good. Well, the first thing to do, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with it when you're starting or when it suits your story, is to literally narrate. Probably not the very words once upon a time, because,
I have actually started a story like that and then deleted it out in the edit.
Yeah, to be fair, what I'm talking about is eventually. And also, to be fair, my publisher Black Shuck Books have an anthology called Dark and Stormy Nights. So, I'm not taking sides against this at all. But my point really is that the fundamentals underlining Once Upon a Time is I am telling you a story and I'm not disguising that I'm telling you a story. So option number one, get on with it. Tell us where we are. Tell us who you're going to talk about. Tell us that Cinderella was getting on with the housework and this is what her past has been like and this is what the problems are right now, so that we've got a sense of the stakes. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. As Emily said, it can become very fairy tale-like. And if that is what you want, regardless of your setting, maybe it's something very modern and unfairy tale-like, but you want that connotation floating around, brilliant. That is one option.
Yep.
Emily, do you have any thoughts about particular stories where you might use a narrator? I mean, probably things you've read rather than things you've written.
Yeah, I mean, I always think of the Gothic tradition. And also, so diary entries and things, all very specifically from a point of view, like
Epistolary.
Dracula. And
I love saying epistolary. Isn't it a beautiful word?
Would you like to say it once more?
No. It's tempting fate.
Jane Eyre is very specifically narrating her own story to the reader.
Bildungsroman. Bildungsroman.
And so this sort of Gothic story voice that can carry the reader through extraordinary events. And obviously, I mean, something like Dracula has multiple of these that are sending letters. It's in letter form, it's in journal form and medical reports. But it always reminds me of that because that's a very sort of point of view driven, I am recounting what happened. This is an account and narration of what occurred.
There's a really lovely modern epistolary version of that, which is letters and emails told within a university setting. And it's a very funny, very human, petty email exchange that does that in that tradition called Dear Committee Members, which was actually given to me by my ex-lecturer, which sort of makes it even better. It tells you that maybe that environment might still be familiar. And it's by Julie Schumacher. And that, again, is a great one to compare with Dracula because it does take what's going on now and why humans do what they do in terms of letter writing and modernise it. It's a really lovely one.
Yeah.
And you're narrating your life and you're very, very unreliable because you're angry and you're emotionally involved and you're not seeing other people, you're seeing your version of other people.
Like Bridget Jones's diary.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we talked about, I mean, if you've not heard our episode about unreliable narrators, might be worth listening to that after this one. But I think we talked about the fact that where a narrator is a human being, a character within a story, they will be, to some extent, if they are a well-written human being, unreliable. We'll talk a bit later about memory and flashbacks in fiction, and I think we'll look at the unreliability of those things.
Yep.
And so therefore any narrator recounting past events will have a degree of either their bias, their slant on it, or...
Fundamentally, if you think you're a reliable narrator, you're a lunatic.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
Yeah. Or at least very far along a spectrum of some kind. Yeah. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
One of the things that is often levelled at the use of narrators as a storytelling device is that it can be an easy option. Both of you have touched on this a little bit. I just want to think about that a little bit more. Why might we say that, and why is it actually not necessarily?
Oh, go on.
I would say, because I didn't use it for Dex. If I had shoehorned it into Dex, or if I had chosen to plough on with it anyway, I would have made my life really difficult in the long run. Because a narrator isn't easier if it doesn't fit, if it doesn't do a job, if it doesn't provide that specific anchor
if
point.
If it's scaffolding that you could have taken down.
Yeah, exactly. And if it is scaffolding you could have taken down, but you have to leave it up, suddenly you've got a bit of a problem. You've got to maintain a whole nother thing, but alongside the main story. So it's not necessarily easier. But if your story does need it and it needs to be done well, that can also be a whole challenge, maintaining the voice as the story evolves. Because there is something about characters evolve and the character voice can evolve with what's happening, but the narrator knows it all from the start. The narrator doesn't evolve. So whatever tone you start off with at the beginning, you've got to carry on with to the end.
Although, potentially, Goethe, I want to tell you my stories to find out if they are true. A narrator can end up wrong, and I did that in Great British Horror 5, where you likely get that the first person is the narrator, but you gradually build to the fact that they're actually about to die and looking back on their youth in this particular story when they discovered the corpse in question. And it grows on you that they are about to die, looking back on death. And I couldn't have done that without letting the narrator learn by telling the story what they need to. And I experienced this having these conversations with you guys, that there will be things that, I might have written notes going, these are the books that I'm going to think of, but then something in the conversation evolves, and that's why being present is so important. And on that note, Fleabag, starting brilliantly, award-winningly, with talking directly to the camera, saying something so personal and not shocking in that sense, but it gets your attention. It makes you realise that she's talking in her head. You're not going to get a kind of tidied view of what she's saying. But the real beauty of this is that at the end of the next series, the man that she's fallen in love with, the hot priest played by Andrew Scott, if we could have an episode on that separately, I would be enormously grateful.
Yeah.
Looks where she's looking. Why do you keep doing that? Why do you keep tuning out? Looks to where the camera is, and he can't see the camera because we're in her head, but he knows it's there. And even saying that, I'm getting that little chill remembering that, because it was such a great device for understanding that we are all in our own heads, and that sometimes people can touch each other's lives. That could not have been done without the device of the narrator, and it works on the page, it works in the scripts. You can read it and still feel that going on.
That's an example of a narrator breaking the fourth wall.
I would say, because that's a different one, because you've got narrators who are not in the story.
Yeah.
But then you've got narrators who are in the story and they are characters in the story. You've got then narrators where the characters are, retelling the story. So it's like in Fleabag, she is telling you the story, but it's kind of happening at the same time. And I would say that that's very present narration. Like, she's narrating what's going on in her head. When you've got something like the Moulin Rouge, the main character narrating what's happened, but it is what's happened.
The woman I love is dead.
In the sort of is removed from it, but observing it, but is still the character in the story and very unmistakably that. And then you've got the fairy tale-esque, this is what's happening. There are so many different ways of doing it. And as I say, it's not easy, but at the same time, a narrator, I think, is one of those things that very organically comes along with the story. I don't think it's the kind of device that you can sort of say, okay, I am going to write a story with a narrator. The narrator is going to be like this. The story is going to unfold like this. Yeah. It's almost like the story has to demand it. maybe I'm wrong in that. Maybe that's just me.
I mean, someone out there will have a different experience because that's the whole thing about writing. But
Exactly.
it's still totally worth saying that by the time you're in final draft stage, and I do mean your draft, not the software, when you are at the end of that and you're ready to submit it or it's being published or whatever's happened, that relationship does need to have evolved. You know, we can all go, it's going to be exactly like this in our first draft, and that gets us through the first draft. But what happens next may be different. But I would say that the narrators that I enjoy, who are genuinely narrating the story, whether they're in it or not, whether they're looking back on it, for me, a lot of the nice ones, they are processing it. So like in the Moulin Rouge, where he's going, the woman I love is dead. This is him processing this. And we don't know, is he going to jump off a roof? Is he going to get on with his life? We don't know. And probably he doesn't know at the beginning either that that's what we're doing in telling our stories. We are working out what we believe the truth to be. And it can work. But I think what we're maybe, the here be dragons for all of us in this room, I think, is don't just stick it there and think that because it's there, it's a good idea. Understand what it's doing, why and how.
Yeah.
So going back to that point of it might be an easier option. I'm using that term in inverted commas because I think we've probably discounted the fact that it is easier. But let's say then instead that it allows us to do different things in our storytelling. So examples of that, it might take some of the pressure off telling the story purely through dialogue. It might allow us to give our readers more vivid, descriptive passages. It might allow us to give opinions on characters if our narrator has a bias. I mean, what else might it give us in terms of devices for our writing?
That bias reminds me very much. My favourite novel of one of my favourite novelists' work is her least favourite. It's Broken Harbour by Tana French. And the first page is this absolutely deeply convincing alpha male telling you why he's right, written by a female author. It's a policeman. We don't know what's happened, but it's what you need to understand is there was absolutely no other decision I could have made at this point. And you get a page of it, and it's, in my opinion, pitch perfect, like very, very stable and convincing. And you get him narrating through the book, and Tana French does not make life easy for her narrators. The fact that they're narrating the story at the beginning does not necessarily mean a happy ending for them, is all I will safely say.
Yeah.
But she does bring him out of the action. He does narrate to you, and there's a very well-held momentum, a relationship between the narration and the action. There's a psychological reality to it that works extremely well, according to me, apparently not according to her. No, I think that's not true. I think she just didn't enjoy writing it rather than that she doesn't enjoy reading it.
I think that's
so
a very
interesting when that
different
happens.
thing. It's like when you're a writer and you set yourself a challenge, it's not necessarily a pleasant challenge. And it's like sometimes you've got, I guess there's a book that I know exists in my head. I don't think I'll ever write it because every time I think about it, it just makes me go, oh, because it's so sad and so desperately awful. I don't know if I've got it in me. You know, like I just don't know if I've got the spoons. I know the entire plot. I know exactly what happens. I know how it evolves and how the characters operate. I do not have the spoons for that story. So, yeah. But anyway, bringing this back to narrators. I think that some of the best narrators are in comedy. And I think that when they're used to highlight farce and farcical situations, and it almost excuses the farce, because it's like, okay, so like in Moulin Rouge, when all of the theatre troupe just fall through his ceiling at the very beginning, it's like when you're recounting a story, sometimes it sounds farcical, and in the moment, it doesn't feel farcical because you're like, what the hell just happened? But when you're recounting it, it is farce and it is funny. And the narrator allows the viewer to feel the farce in the moment as opposed to retrospectively. It's a present time, future retelling. And you only get the sense of that farce retrospectively after you've almost applied that filter, but it allows you to do it at the same time. And that, I think, works really, really well. Just to sort of like shortcut to the farce, shortcut to the funny of this. You know, it's a shortcut and really gets to the essence of the mood.
And Peep Show as well, while we're
Oh,
on.
God.
And again, these narrators are, as with Fleabag, in their heads, very, very conscious and articulate about what's wrong with them as people.
Yeah.
Well, except for the overbearing flatmate who maybe could do with some more of that. But that's the enjoyable thing, isn't it? We're all slagging ourselves off in our heads quite a lot of the time. And being able to contrast that in that head on TV with what goes on in dialogue is something that normally is prose's problem. It's something that's ours to do. And to see it on TV was brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gosh, I am plugging David Mitchell a lot today, aren't I?
Yeah, well, I mean...
Did he drop you some money last night? Is that...
Not that I've noticed.
Oh, wow.
David Mitchell, it's not too late.
Just send him an invoice.
Will do.
Yeah.
Well, I had the pleasure of interviewing Izzy Sooty a couple of years ago.
Oh, I love Izzy Sooty.
I just wanted her to be Dobby in in the interview, and of course she wasn't. She was Izzy, but
you got to do that.
Commiserations, Chris.
I was starstruck, I have to say.
Oh.
So, if we choose to use a narrator in our writing, are there occasions where we could overuse or underuse a narrator, do you think? I'm thinking also of when do we use narrators? I mean, you wouldn't chuck a narrator in 50 pages into your
it's got to be
story.
Consistent.
You've got to introduce that early on, and then it's got to be, as you say, consistent.
It's avoiding duet smashner, isn't it? It's making sure that you've got your world rules, whether you state them or not. We feel them. That's what Pratchett and the guide get right. Yeah.
So the supply. I mean, so I think we're saying, without actually saying it, there's probably a bit of planning you need to be doing around.
Me, I don't experience it as planning, and it probably is. I'm probably wrong, but the way that I experience it is what happens here. So just to take an example, taking something completely contrary to that, just for the basis of comparison, the Thursday Murder Club. You're in a different character's head per chapter, and you get to see the murder, and you get to see the reactions to the murder, and you get to see the far-flung more and more reactions of the community around it, and you get all the parts of the investigation, and you get the pain that the other characters don't know that the individual characters are swallowing in order to make the situations work, the friendships work, to move forward. So the narrator, I would privately experience or argue, the Richard Osman, if you like, god of the universe putting the bits together, is very much present. And again, I guess it is a parallel with that idea of the sense of humour of the universe that I used before, that what is the personality that we never quite see? We don't see behind that curtain, but we feel that presence. There is that kind of it. And therefore, if you take it to the other end of the spectrum, there is the once upon a time factor. There is the I acknowledge that I am standing here. I don't want to say between you and the story, but I am the tunnel between you and the story. I am the conduit by which you get.
And the filter through which you view it. So you're getting my biases, my opinions, my thoughts.
Yeah. But that's what makes it a relationship.
Sure.
I would say in terms of like a mechanical situation, if you are like, so for instance, if you're writing an audio drama and you're planning out episodes and you're working out where it's going to fall, the way I would approach it is to plan out the episode and include the narrator. Sometimes to include the narrator happens organically, but then you've got to examine where they are and how much they are. And if it turns out that in an episode, you might find that in an episode, it works really, really well to have 3 instances, beginning, middle, and end, where the narrator butts in and says something. But then you might write an episode where they've done this 6 times. And then you've got to think, okay, is it necessary for them to be there those 6 times? Or can we somehow rearrange this? Can a chunk of narrator actually be lost and do that same storytelling with the characters? Can 2 chunks of narrator be put into one in, a bit more of an extended form?
Taking the training wheels off.
Exactly. But it's, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say you have to plan explicitly where they happen, write the episode, but then take a bird's eye look. Where is this narrator? How much is this narrator? Why is this narrator? You want a narrator to not be overbearing, but to be there enough that people aren't surprised when they turn up. So that you have that familiar, regular anchor into the narrator voice. You don't want them to be overbearing. if suddenly it turns out that you've got a show that used to be, you get a bit of narrator here and there, and then suddenly 60% of the episode is narrator. Then you potentially need to reassess a few things. And then maybe your show is naturally sort of evolving towards a narrator-driven thing. That's fine, but know why you're doing it, know what you're doing, be critical about it. One of the exercises that I do when I'm whispering to myself around the house, which drives my spouse nuts and, is really creepy, but I have these whisper conversations. And one of the things that I'm regularly doing in that is asking myself questions of myself and what I'm doing in my books, the decisions I'm making in my books. Why are you doing that to that character? What function is that performing? Because I'm someone who does panels. And if somebody asked me a question, I would need to answer it. I would need to have a damn good reason behind that choice that I've made narratively. There's nothing worse as a writer than being asked quite a probing question about your work and then going, yeah, no idea. I have no idea why I did that. And sitting there in front of an audience of hopeful people who have invested in you, thinking you know what you're doing, and then really sort of proving that you have absolutely no idea what you're doing. And as much as we don't have any idea what we're doing, you don't necessarily want to admit that in front of a room full of people. So you've got to have an answer ready. Yeah. And there is something about interviewing yourself. What am I doing with this narrator? Why am I doing it with this narrator? What is the voice? Where did the voice come from? These questions are interesting to ask yourself and also kind of vital and very comforting, because you never know when you're going to run into somebody who's going to ask you a really, really difficult question. Yeah. And yeah.
So it's kind of giving future you a defence or a justification for what you've done.
That's exactly it. It's rehearsal. Yeah. And I think because I'm neurodivergent as well, I rehearse conversations in my head. Yeah. I've always done that, since I was a kid. And then also the flip side of that is going back over conversations and being like,
what I should have said was this.
But yeah, like really what you're doing.
I think we all do that.
Yeah. But I mean, like you're rehearsing conversations before they come up and you're rehearsing what you would say. I find this really interesting. And I had a really awkward moment with a friend who is a writer who asked me why I chose to do something in my narrative, and I couldn't answer it. And later on I could, but I had to really think about it. And I know that I'd sort of failed myself in that moment by not being able to provide an answer. And it was an important question. Yeah. It was a core question. So that's where it comes from. But yeah, interrogating yourself through your work. What is this narrator doing? How often are they doing it? Why are they doing it?
Yes.
Being on purpose.
Just linking that with narration in fiction and drama, a colleague of mine who was on the first series of the Writers' Gym with me, John Paul Flintoff, talks a lot about when he was in psychiatric care and how he reintegrated in the world. It wasn't for a long period, but it was extremely significant in his life, and how he came out of that with the technique, okay, John Paul is sitting, he is doing this, he is standing, he is doing that, he'll probably be all right, and narrating what he was doing. So it feels like a slight parallel with, I do talk to a lot of clients who are rehearsing conversations in their head. It's a very, very common thing. And it becomes a question of what's the narrator for? And as we are saying with our fiction in the Writers' Gym today, knowing when the narrator is helping you and knowing when the narrator is there just because the scaffolding was very useful at one point, but now you're actually getting braver and you're getting more independent, and maybe you can try without it. And it's very interesting how literary narrative behaviours and emotional ones have a lot to say about each other.
Yeah.
There's probably something that I won't touch on today because we could be here for a lot longer, but that narration versus commentary actually is an interesting one. Am I narrating things, or am I describing? And
if you catch yourself in the book being commentary rather than narration, that's when you know you can cut, because that's when we're in exposition zone.
Yeah. In the interests of brevity, which is not always a quality we show on this podcast. Rachel, do you have an exercise or challenge for our listeners?
Cut and see what happens. If you came in with the narrator, do a version without them. It doesn't mean it will necessarily be the version you pick, but you will know with crystal clarity whether you want the narrator or you don't. Part B, clarify their reason for being there, and do a beginning and ending that show you how the narrative voice evolves, or if maybe they don't learn what they set out to learn by telling us this story. Maybe they do.
Interesting. And just finally, Emily, any more thoughts from you on narrators, their use or otherwise? Any really good examples of narrators in fiction that you'd like to share with us?
Emily thought for a moment, her brain suddenly empty at the presence of such a unexpected question.
She looked across the room at Chris.
She looked across the room at Chris and panicked.
This wasn't in the notes you shared with us, she
This
said.
was not in the notes that were shared, and how very dare he. No, I think that pretty much says it all.
So given how much we both loved and learnt from the Disney Robin Hood, it's amazing it took us a while to think about this.
Yeah, we literally just thought about it and decided to do this bonus little bit because it needed to be said.
I'm going to ask, shall we forego the singing, which seems a bit of a shame?
No.
Okay.
Got to do it. It's obvious.
Including all the irrelevant bits, right?
I mean, just the beginning bit.
Okay.
We don't have to do the whole
Robin
song.
Hood and Little John
walking through the forest,
talking back and forth.
what the other had to say. Okay, we're cutting it. All right. But we were talking about Alan Dale, the minstrel, and the way that he introduces himself as a narrator after the exquisite opening that we have just sung bits of.
Well,
to
maybe
each other.
we'll play it. Can we do that, Disney?
Very much no.
They'll sue the arse off us.
This is why I was thinking maybe if we can just quote a couple of lines
I'll
of
do it. I'll do it. Hold on.
Okay. Yeah.
Robin Hood and Little John walking through the forest, talking back and forth at what the other has to say. Reminiscing this and that and having such a good time. Ooda lally, golly, what a day. Yeah, that one.
And then going for the other, going for the other mood. We've met him. He's part of all the songs. And then when there is the taxing of the poor, we're being told about this by his voiceover, and he's talking about them all going to prison. And then suddenly we see him on the other side of the window of the prison, and he says, within this introduction to a song talking about how awful everything is, "Yep, I'm in here too. Nottingham was in deep trouble." And then the song begins about how awful it is for them. And as a child, understanding what a narrator does, it was one thing. But another thing about it was it showed how the narrator can make you understand quite how personal history is, and that this is happening to people just like me. And it did all of that. So we were thinking about that. But the other thing is when he introduced himself at the very beginning, what he said was, "Incidentally, I'm Alan Dale, a minstrel." And that's an early day folk singer. And the fact that he said early day, you knew that the narrator has all of time and space, just like the book in Douglas Adams, just like Harry Pratchett.
Yeah.
And my job is to tell it like it is.
Or was. Yeah.
Or whatever. And that is just the best explanation of what a narrator is I've ever heard.
Yeah. I think it's just beautiful, and it's so iconic, and it's classic, and it's one of those that most people will have heard of and known and loved. And yeah, perfect example of what a narrator is and can do, and how it can ground you. Really, really well done. And musical as well. Who doesn't love that? It got me to sing, people. That'll never happen again.
So we will end this podcast, have a go at writing a narrator, play around with a narrator, play around with the different types of narrators. As always, let us know on social media how you get on, and if you've enjoyed the challenge.
And who's your favourite narrator?
Yes, who's your favourite?
What's your favourite narrator? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Rachel Knightley.
Chris Gregory.
Emily Inkpen.
Chris Gregory.
And to our lovely listeners, thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on The Writer's Gym.
Said Chris.
Thank you for listening to The Writer's Gym podcast with Rachel Knightley, Emily Inkpen, and me, Chris Gregory. If you'd like to learn more about Rachel and The Writer's Gym, please go to rachelknightley.com. To find out more about Emily, please go to emilyinkpen.com. And for Chris, go to alternativestories.com. We'll print all these links and more in the show notes for this podcast. The Writer's Gym podcast is an Alternative Stories 2024 production for The Writer's Gym. Production, sound design and editing were by me, Chris Gregory.